Thanks, guys, for joining us for this first LEAP conversation for the WRBC. This is designed to help church leaders. LEAP stands for we want to learn from each other. We want to be an encouragement to each other. We want to get acquainted with each other better. And then we want to know how we can more intentionally pray for each other. So I appreciate you four men taking time out of your day today to do this. And hopefully these conversations will be fruitful for us and then maybe anyone else who listens to this later on. So thanks for joining us. Let me tell you a little bit about the idea here. We want it to be a free-flowing conversation. I'm just going to throw out some conversation starters. You guys participate, and we're not looking for a lot of scripting here. No one has gotten anything ahead of time. We're just trying to have a free-flowing conversation that might be helpful to us and to anyone who will listen to this. So the first thing I wanted to throw out there is a really easy topic here, and that is, what do you men perceive as the greatest threat to church unity right now? What do you perceive to be a threat to church unity? So
you mean beside masks?
Yeah, well, I mean that's definitely one of them for sure. But yeah, we can talk about that, or we can talk about something else that you perceive.
What if I could ask you, just for clarification, what are you thinking unity? Are you talking doctrinal unity, fellowship, maybe denominational unity? Because it's pretty broad term.
Yeah, I actually, thanks for clarifying that. I was thinking intentionally to keep it broad so that you could go in any one of those directions. So
okay.
You can go for doctrinal unity. You can go for unity within your church or with what you're seeing in Christianity at large. Things like that.
Okay.
I think.
Go ahead, Dave.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think perhaps the biggest threat is, at least as I see it, is that the church has replaced Christ with conservatism. In other words, I'm a real Christian because of, and it has to do with being conservative. It doesn't have to do with Christ. And as a result, we get into these disputes over masks, over becoming magnetized with COVID-19 vaccines, and all of this other stuff. Because then that has become our identity. In other words, conservatism is in the process of replacing Christ within the church.
Okay, so how would you define being conservative then? Not disagreeing at all with you, just asking for some clarification. How would you define that as being what conservative is?
I think it's a political philosophy.
Okay.
Okay. It's a cultural philosophy. It's a sociological philosophy that has kind of come in and supplanted Christ and gotten our eyes off of Christ. And then our identification becomes with that. And then we begin identifying with certain leaders, certain parties, certain cultural things, rather than Christ.
So what's the answer to that then? And then, Dave, I want to hear your response to that. Then I'd like to hear, from the other guys responding to that too. But so if that is indeed a big threat to the church, what do you think the response is on a real practical level for that?
the response has to be getting people to focus on Christ. Okay. It has to be a changing of the focus from the here and now to what we've been called to.
Okay.
Okay. How do I put this? It's easier to be focused on masks, okay, than it is to be focused on the message of Christ. And I think the church is the conservative church has kind of lost their focus, lost their sight on that. That's just kind of personal observation, not any one particular person or any one particular church or any one particular evangelical or conservative, independent, person or group. But just standing back and looking at the center and center right is that has been replaced. Christ has been replaced with culture and has been replaced with conservatism.
Okay, let me hear from the other guys on this. So I think regardless of whether we agree with David's response, I'm not saying I do or don't. That's not the point. The point is, I think we all would agree that it should be a goal as church leaders to help people keep their focus on Christ. I think that we all would agree on that. So how do we encourage people to do that? What is your personal approach to that? Let's start with you, Vic. What do you think about how we should encourage people, and how, what steps do you take personally to keep your eyes on Christ, and how should we lead in that way? What do you think, Vic? And for those you don't know, before you answer, Vic, Vic's our treasurer for WRBC, and so I so appreciate all the work he does for us, and really appreciate that. So Vic, give us your thoughts on that.
I do lead a Bible study on Wednesday nights, and the emphasis there has to be on Scripture. And we can get on rabbit trails, but we need to pull off of those rabbit trails and get back to Christ. It's just a continual reaffirming of where we're headed and keep that focus. I don't think that we jump on people who are talking conservative things, because there are issues that do affect Christianity going on in the culture. Mm-hmm. But when we emphasize things within the church, we need to emphasize Christ and not speak from the pulpit or from teacher positions or something like that to promote positions, but promote understanding of scriptural principles. Some of those scriptural principles will affect our everyday life. They should, and should affect how we see things. But we don't need to emphasize that. We can draw those conclusions ourselves without having to lead the church into that.
So what I'm hearing you say is, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, that our job as church leaders isn't necessarily to endorse political positions or candidates and things like that. but more of our lane that we should run in is teaching people scriptural principles and allowing them to make those application points for their own personal views on political issues. Am I capturing your thoughts on that?
That's what I say. Yeah, I'd agree with that. When you get into discussions off of your teaching area or your preaching area, be kind and try to guide people away from negative responses and to keep the discussion on Christ.
Okay. Josh, how do you think we should try to keep the focus on Christ in our churches, personally? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic. I'm just going through some scriptures here, thinking through all the different venues. You know, if I'm going to address this issue from, say, the standpoint of fellowship within my own local congregational church body, I think I'm going to address that a little bit differently than if I'm talking, you know, we've got 14 churches in town, how I'm going to relate to them. You know, you move outside of that, Wisconsin, so on and so forth. But the first thing that comes to my mind is, and this isn't a cultural thing, you go back to Romans chapter 1, verses 18, 19, 20. The real issue there was that they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. And they did that willingly and knowingly. And that's why God was just to judge them. So you have residual actions, or you have consequences of that. There's excessive amounts of violence and homosexuality, things that could be cultural topics or cultural events that could divide people. But ultimately you go back, that was elimination of truth, and they started believing those things. First Timothy chapter 4, he talks the same thing about in latter times there will be hypocrisies and lies and deceptions, but he also talks about leaving the truth. And that truth is what grounds us, what leads us into righteousness, and ultimately what unifies us. At our church, we try to emphasize the fact that fellowship is not a Sunday after service thing that we do sitting around the table, but fellowship, going back to Acts chapter 2, is having all things common. In Acts 2, their lives were intimately integrated with each other. So what kept them together was dependency on each other, a knowledge of each other, and a common belief system. So taking Romans 1 and 1 Timothy 4, I'd say what really tears us apart and divides us is an acceptance of that which is not true, as if it were true. And I think that's where you start finding denominational tears. That's where you start seeing arguments within church bodies, whether you're talking doctrinal or the color of the carpet, those types of things. It comes down to what's true, what's important. And I agree with David, nothing is more important than Christ. But as soon as Christ is no longer Savior or deity or the second member of the Trinity or 100% God, 100% man, now we've got divisions, arguments, separation, those types of things. So
yeah, that's helpful. I appreciate that.
Yep.
Steve, you have slightly less than 1 million years of pastoral experience, and you travel around our state and you see things. What would be your word of encouragement to pastors about keeping Christ center, focusing on Christ? How would you or try to put your arm around a pastor that's maybe just beginning or something like that? What advice would you give them for that?
That's that's what in a way, almost every sermon you want to conclude by, let's get back to Christ. Let's get back to what it's all about. But as far as actually doing it, God has to do some of that.
Mm-hmm.
So prayer is obviously an important part. So in our experience at Kiel, the vast majority of our time there was spent in great unity and peace and happy people meeting and worshiping together, but not all of it. So
Right.
we had some years that were as shameful as any church that I'm aware of. And that's just, I don't know that I did anything different. Do you know what I'm saying? You can do the same thing, but God has to work, and I guess the normal thing, you do your job and trust the Lord, and in His kindness, you'll be blessed if He sends peace and unity. We, as I get into other churches, it just seems to me that most churches, you sense it. Maybe each church has kind of a spiritual. It's an unseen. There's an atmosphere, an aura, mysticist that I am, that you just kind of leave with a feeling about, and most of the churches are happy places. It's my opinion, and sometimes it's kind of eerie, and I don't know why that is. So I don't know if that's much of an answer or not, but I think a lot of it is up to the working of God. Just praise God if things are good where you are. I do know in our church, we have some people who are very politically concerned and would view political action as a significant part of the problem to solve what's wrong with America, way more than me. And I'm probably on the other end. But we get along. I can see how their actions and attitudes might be divisive, but I do think they love Jesus. They don't see it all like I do, but that's where we are.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that, and it's a good testimony that when you can have differing opinions on things and still walk in unity. I think pastors, we just need to understand that we're going to be leading environments that have a tremendous amount of disagreement. We have that here in the church where I serve, particularly in response to COVID. There's been if you can think of a suggested response on how we should handle this, we probably have heard it, on both ends, on the very restrictive side, and then to the, we shouldn't do anything. And so it makes it difficult that you have to lead a group of people well, and they're not always going to appreciate your response to something. But this goes back to David's original point, is if we as leaders can keep pointing people back to Christ, I think that's the great equalizer here. You look at the 12 disciples that Jesus had, they had vastly different political backgrounds. You have Matthew, the tax collector, and you have Simon, the zealot. You can't get two opposite ends of the spectrum there that Jesus calls to work together as a team. I just love that picture of that. So this is really helpful. Let me switch gears a little bit. David, I'll throw this question to you first, and then if you want to respond to anything that before you answer it, that's fine, because you started a previous thread. But the opposite direction, what do you perceive to be a great opportunity for the church at large right now, where we're at in our period of history? What's a great opportunity? Maybe we've already answered some of that, but I didn't know if you had a more nuanced response to that. And then I'll let the other guys chime in on that too. What do you think, David, is a great opportunity for the church right now in history?
I think the church is facing an unparalleled opportunity, at least here in America, for the gospel. People are more upset. They're more, to use a term, discombobulated, not knowing which end is up. They're off kilter, off center. They're afraid. The American West is burning. The South and the East is flooding. COVID is going through and ravaging. My wife being a nurse, and they're wanting her to pull extra shifts now, and she's saying, I can't, so do I quit? The things that are going, disasters in the Middle East, all these different things are going on. We're entering a time of inflation that we haven't seen for 30 years. I remember a couple of years ago, I was talking to people and saying, I remember times when there were shortages in stores. I don't think we're too far from that. And they looked at me like they thought I was nuts. We're facing that again today. Just when you look at the general condition of things, the world, I think, is ready for hope, is ready for some answers. Now, whether they want to receive that or not is another question. Okay, but I think at the point, I mean, it's almost like Jesus said that he lifted up his eyes and the fields are white unto harvest. I think with everything that's going on, we can walk around and say, you know, woe is me, I can't afford this at the grocery store anymore. And, you know, the country is taking this kind of a turn, and, you know, look at this. And do you think maybe God is upset with us, you know, with a question mark, and go, no, duh, open your eyes. But I think the world around us is expecting something, and as believers, we have answers. And so I think we have the opportunity. Now we can squander that opportunity, okay, by offering the same solutions that the world offers. Or we can offer another opportunity. I had a person approach me and was struggling with, not a member of the church, but kind of peripheral, and really struggling with things like anxiety and having some kind of attacks. And for the first time, some family members had talked them into seeing a counselor and whatnot. And I met with them and I said, okay, here's the type of coping mechanisms the world will give you. And they're not bad crutches, but they will help you through in the midst of that. However, as a pastor, I will deal with those, but I will also deal with this, because here on the other side, unless we put this with this, there is no solution. This is going to be a continuing, ongoing battle for you.
Yeah.
And I said, so you have to decide, are you willing to spend some time over here with the scriptures and the inner life and some of those kinds of things as well? And they politely smiled and said thank you and never came back. Okay. So even as the church and even as leaders within the church, we can offer the same type of solutions, although it comes from a quote unquote godly perspective, that the world offers, or we need to offer them something that is completely different, in Christ and the spiritual life that they're not having, because we've seemed to have truncated that. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I would summarize that, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, but I would summarize that what you're advocating is, yeah, it's okay, and we need to deal with symptoms of the problem, but we have to get to the root issue of the problem.
Right.
So it's perfectly acceptable to put a Band-Aid or something like that on and help the healing process and dealing with the initial conflict, but we got to figure out why these cuts or whatever are happening to begin with. And I think that's what you're saying, that Christianity offers the hope of dealing with the root issue. And that's really the opportunity we have. We have the opportunity to give hope in a huge world of uncertainty rather than just coping mechanisms.
Right, because people still want, I think one of the basic desires is people still want to get back to the garden. That's what drives socialism. That's what drove the hippies and the communes. Get back to the garden, get back to that place of peace, get back to that place of tranquility. Okay, get back to that place to where we're all kind of in this together and we're not conflicted. And people are still wanting that in the midst of all of this conflict, and they're looking every place else for that.
Yeah.
And in preaching through the book of Revelation, I'm getting ready to end that. The interesting thing is that Genesis starts with the garden and ends, with that tree of life and,
right.
and the garden and the rivers and whatnot. So that is still there. And we have an unparalleled opportunity today to take that and to offer that to the world.
Yeah.
Whether they receive it or not is not our problem, but it is our responsibility to give it to them.
Sure.
The opportunity. How they respond to it is not up to us.
Yeah. Josh, what do you think about these, a great opportunity at large, or even in your own community? What are you seeing as a great opportunity for sharing Christ or whatever for you?
Yeah, I was thinking through the question, and to admit my narrow-mindedness, I was thinking primarily the American church, and I guess that's to acknowledge that the church is not America or only in America. It's universal, it's worldwide, and even throughout history. But I was thinking about the American church, and what came to my mind was we are an excessively blessed body. So, we so take for granted, we so take for granted that we have buildings and air conditioners and pews and seats and Bibles and, advertising methods and promotional media, those types of things. And I think the result is that the American church, not unique, but definitely represented in us, I think we're a very soft church. And what I mean by a soft church is, say, go back to James chapter 1, Romans 5, Hebrews 5. God always sanctifies the body through trials. Okay, let me be cautious about the word always. But he primarily, and in a great fashion, he sanctifies the body through trials. So in the absence of trials, we have to ask ourselves, how much sanctification is really going on? You can look at, I think the blessing we have is we are basically set for a great revival, if God so chooses, through a lot of the cultural, social, theological issues that we're facing, attacking the church and starting to question the church, starting to question the truth, starting to question something as basic as gender identification. The church is really sitting at a point where persecution, trial, difficulties boy, there's a big door that's wide open for us to develop a lot of sanctification. And I don't think that's a selfish thing. You've got other aspects such as the spreading of the gospel. Historically, God has used persecution and trial to spread the gospel. He's used situations like the Tower of Babel and to, confound the people, great chaos amongst them. What happens? Spreads the gospel. So as soft as we are, boy, we're really just set for a great opportunity for sanctification and the spreading of the gospel. Throw into that, say, Romans chapter 11, Paul is describing the purpose of opening the gospel to the Gentiles is to try to develop some appreciation in Israel for what they had. And if we get some of our rights and freedoms and liberties taken away from us, we might have a little bit of a revival in ourselves, remembering how great we had it, what we had, and why we should be so much more protective of that as well. So it's kind of an odd approach, but I think we're primed for some spectacular things if God so chooses to walk us down that road.
Yeah, I think that's a great application and a reminder, even from Romans 11 there. I'm preaching through I started a series last week on the 7 churches in Revelation. And so this week is Church of Smyrna, and that's the persecuted church. And so, yeah, that's helpful. So I hear you saying that the opportunity is revival and sanctification.
Yeah.
I love the optimism, and I agree.
Yeah.
Vic, what do you see as a great opportunity in your world or the world at large concerning the church and where we're at in this point in history? I don't know, Vic, can you hear us?
Yeah, I hear you. I wasn't ready to discuss that. I was thinking about what was going on here in the discussion here.
Sure. I can throw it over to Steve if you want.
Yeah. Please.
All right, Steve, you're up. What do you see as opportunities?
Surprise.
Yeah, I'm good. I just think there's an opportunity. There has to be an opportunity for outreach. There has to be an opportunity for people to see the difference between who they are and who true believers are. I mean, there's never been a greater time for us to show them love when they just see fear every other place.
Yeah.
And they see a culture that's filled with anger, and they ought to see in our own life and in our church, this is a happy place. This is a peaceful place where we shouldn't be driven and controlled by conflict. There's so much uncertainty about who can you believe. We know who to believe, and we have confidence. There is certainty in our lives. And while their lives are unraveling, our lives ought to be combobulated. So I think, I just think the contrast between what the Bible portrays as a normal Christian living ought to stand out as light in darkness, as I don't know of any time, but as in few times in my time here on earth. I just think the opportunity is there.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that I don't know where I read this or heard this for the first time. It's not original with me, but God creates the man for the hour and the hour for the man. And it's that this was a point I raised in one of my leadership classes that I teach. I raised the question of, like, would Abraham Lincoln been a great president had the Civil War not happened, would we look back to him and think of that? So the question is framed in such as it's a false dichotomy, but it's just to promote discussion. But the idea is of, did the circumstances that Lincoln found himself in, did that create his great leadership, or would he have been there anyway? And of course, the answer is, well, we don't know, of course. But I pointed back to God's sovereign plan. Well, he created the man for the hour, but he also created the hour for the man. And this is where we're at as church leaders. And whether we're leading Bible studies, whether we're preaching sermons, small groups, interacting with friends over coffee, God has given us good opportunity here. Let me move.
Jeremy, could I ask a question?
Please do.
Yeah, whether you want to answer this or somebody else, the question is, great opportunity sort of historically that the church faces. What would be some times in history that the church was at a great place, recognizing that, you go back from a dispensational standpoint, the church looks different in the Old Testament, but what were some times that the church did look good, and what was it that made the church be in a good place? What was that opportunistic moment? Might help us see what we have or could have if we go back and identify what were the good times in the history of the church.
That's a good question. I mean, from a church history standpoint, I think I don't know how these other guys would answer. My first response is that Christ will build his church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And so I think there's always been a remnant. There's always been a beautiful church. There's been different times in history where that's been more widely and more obvious to a larger audience. I go back to a story that a missionary friend of mine told me. He's a dentist, and he has this interesting ministry where he goes to these closed countries and he does dental work free, and then usually there's a missionary he partners with and stuff. But he was in this extremely closed country that they would not allow him or anyone to preach the gospel or anything. And they had a government official sitting next to him the entire time so that he would not say anything about Christianity, but they wanted his services as a dentist to help the people. And so he was praying every day that week, give me an opportunity to witness, give me an opportunity to share Christ. But this government official literally sitting next to him and would not leave his side. There was a national assistant that was helping him. And at one point, the government official did leave for about 10 seconds out the door. And it was in that moment that this national assistant turned to my friend, the dentist, and said, "Don't worry about the church. We're very strong here." And then went back to work. And that was it. I think that's just a beautiful story that the church is thriving. And to your point, I think it was your point earlier that persecution, sometimes that's where we flourish the most. So, but more obvious, I think the Reformation time obviously was a time where the church shone brightly to stand against truth. I think that there has been any time the church has to take a hard stand for biblical truth and theology, that's a purifying time in its history. Of course, we can go to the Great Awakening here in our own country, which was a wonderful thing. But again, that was in the backdrop of persecution. I mean, Whitefield didn't have it easy, right? Jonathan Edwards, to go to a slightly different time later on, he got kicked out of his church, So, but I think that there's always a remnant. That's my initial response. I don't know how David or Steve would respond to that.
I think it's a hard question, and we should say that only Jeremy can ask questions from now on. I think one lesson I learned from preaching through the 7 churches in Revelation is it is pretty hard to find a church that doesn't have its nevertheless I have something against you. And I think in every era you're going to find good things, and you're going to find, well, that wasn't exactly right. But I don't think, it doesn't mean that they were, I think their heart was right. It's just like you look at the life of David. How in the world can he be called a man after God's own heart? And yet, I know myself as well. So I just think it is a hard question, because with most every era and in most every local church or denominational groups, you're gonna find strengths and weaknesses. But it just goes back to the heart. You gotta love Jesus. You gotta have a clear conscience and stay true to what you think is right.
Oh. David, do you have a response to Josh's question, or should I punt it a different direction here?
Oh. Yeah, I don't know. Punt it a different direction.
Okay. We'll just assume that my answer was sufficient then. So.
Yeah.
Well, we're actually coming up on the clock here that I don't want to keep these too long. And so I'm just going to end with this, and I'll start. So I'll give you guys a chance to think about this. Here's my last segment that I just want to talk about quickly, is to share some person that you admire that has been helpful to you in your life. Mainly spiritually is what we're looking for here. And so I'll go first so you guys can start thinking about who that person may be, and to save any awkwardness, Josh, you cannot say your father. So, all right. So
does that mean he has to use me?
So, well, yeah. You guys, you cannot use each other here. So, but I will start so you guys can begin to think. My grandfather actually is someone who God used to really influence my life. He went home to be with the Lord when I was 17 years old. So I didn't have many years with him. I wish I had more years than I did. But the years I did have with him were very influential. He was a man who was a very simple man. I think 8th grade was his highest education. Went off to World War II. Got a couple Purple Hearts there. Worked in a factory kind of, his whole life. This real simple guy, but in his later adult years, God really challenged him to read the scriptures, and so he would read the Bible every year, cover to cover, and then he would read it 2 or 3 times. And I remember one year I asked him, and he'd read the Bible through 7 times in 1 year, cover to cover. It was something that he just wanted to know the word. He would I asked him one time, I lived with him for a month, just the circumstances of my family was moving and all that stuff, and I stayed with him for a month, and he got up very early every morning, and my idea of retirement was, you sleep in, so I'm a teenager at the time. And I said, Grandpa, why do you get up so early? And he said, well, my son, which is my father, he says, my son has to get up for work at 4 every day to go to work, and I want to be praying for him when he starts his day. Now, I'm not saying every dad has to do that, of course, but that really was influential on me. Him reading the scriptures, him asking us to memorize scripture. He also was my 4th grade Sunday school teacher. And I remember I shared this on a post on Facebook. I remember that he asked us to memorize Psalm 8. And every time I read Psalm 8 or hear it, I think back to that Sunday school class when he said, hey, well, let's memorize this. And he talked about why it was so important. I don't remember anything about the teaching curriculum that year, nothing. But I remember that he wanted Psalm 8 to be in our souls and our minds and our hearts. And that's been influential to me. So my grandfather, I often wish that he would have been alive to see me as a pastor. He prayed that some of his grandkids would go into the ministry, and there's 2 of us grandkids that became pastors and at one point. And so God answered that prayer, and yeah, I wish he could have seen that, but but the Lord called him home when I was only 17. So, but he's been enjoying heaven, and I still bear all the fruit of that influence in my life. So, my grandfather, my son's middle name is Robert, after my grandfather. So that'd be someone that I'd put up there. So, all right, let's go with you, Steve, first.
Sure. Probably the most influential human, one of the most spiritually influential humans would be the pastor under whose ministry I was saved. Was Pastor Bill Darrow. He graduated from Faith Baptist Bible College, came to live and minister at the church in Knapp, where there was basically one family. And pretty much, I think the entire time he was there, had a full-time job, taught Sunday school, preached in the morning, preached in the evening. Wednesday nights, typically he had his Bible college doctrine notes, and he would work his way through the Bible doctrines. He had, as the church began to grow and people were getting saved, my family was one of those who got saved under his ministry, but had a very active, we would sometimes have up to, Knapp was 424 people. We'd have a youth group of about 20 kids on a regular basis. And so he's always been just one of those guys. What would Pastor Darrow do? And it's just you appreciate the sacrifice, that he's just there because God called him, and he encouraged me to go to Bible college. And I'm like, I'm in no way interested in ministry. He said, you don't have to be. Just go for one semester and see how it goes. And always was an encouragement. He's been one that I could always call if I needed counsel. And I just appreciate the influence he's had. And he taught me how to tie a bow tie. I went to a WRBC fall conference with him, and stayed in the same motel room. And I was going to Bible college and had to learn how to tie a tie, and I didn't know how to do it. So he taught me the double Windsor. So thank you, Bill Darrow.
All right. So a regular necktie, not a bow tie, right?
No, a regular necktie.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Because I can't do the bow tie thing.
I can't either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how. Yeah, I don't know how people do it. Neckties, yeah. The double Windsor's my go-to knot as well. So that's a good knot. So very cool. Josh, who would you list as someone who has been influential for you in your life?
Sure. First of all, before I answer that, on a bow tie, like you grab right up here, if you look real close on the back, there's a little metal hook. That's how you tie it. You just put that over your shirt. That's
that's why that's there.
Yeah. It's not for scratching or cleaning your ear. That's so. Historically, I'd say there are two pastors that have influenced me the most. One was as an unbeliever. Invited to church. The pastor of the church really took me, under his wing and as part of his family, taught me a lot. I would say more so than just the scriptures, taught me what it was to be a godly man. And then another pastor at a church not too far from here that I met, can't remember the guy's name, but he was a good guy, just taught me a lot about what it is to be a godly man, a godly husband. So historically, I'd say those two have had the biggest impact on me as a dad and as a man. Not being raised in a Christian home, I didn't have any of that. But I'd say in the last 12 years since I've been at the church here in Ripon, I think really what has influenced me the most are the people that I have had to confront or discipline or approach for sin issues, those types of things. And some of those were issues that were really bad and people had to be removed. some of those were people that were good Christians who just fell short and had to be, brought back. But having to face those people, confront those individuals, and even in that process, like Matthew chapter 7 says, that before you point out the sliver in somebody's eye, you better check the plank in your own. And every time I've had to address a sin issue, a discipline issue, anything like that, man, it's just so forced me to step into my own life and ask myself, am I even remotely worthy to be addressing these issues? And Jeremy, when you asked the question, first thing that came to my mind was what person? And I realized it's a lot of people, but it's the situation connected with those people that's really impacted and affected me in that process.
That's good. David.
A pastor by the name of David Hay. He was a conservative Baptist pastor, and he pastored a larger church. And my wife and I had started going there. This is pre-ministry days, anything to do with that. And because of some infighting at the church to where we were at. And I watched him in the way that he did things and the way that he handled things, the way that he handled family problems with a rebellious son. And there were a couple of other things. I watched the way that he handled things within the church and the difficulties that he experienced within the church. I wound up serving on the finance committee. The church was large enough, it had a finance committee. And it would meet on the same night as the deacons and the trustees and whatnot. And he would rotate among the different groups. And he would walk in and he would sit down and he would kind of lean his chair back against the wall. And he would listen to everybody. He would ask a question or two, get up and walk out. And it was amazing the impact that he had, that he knew, and the way that people then, the way things changed and the way the conversations went. I watched his preaching a lot and listened to him. And it was sometime later that I realized how large of an impact that he's had on me. In the way sometimes that I see things and in the way that I deal with people, and even my preaching, even much more so than the preaching, than the homiletics professors I had at seminary. Okay. The way that he would preach simply and that he would preach through books of the Bible. And he would bring it down to, he was a seminary graduate and I had no clue what that was at the time when we were there, or anything else. And, but the way that he would bring it down and he would put it on a plate to where the simplest person would be able to understand what was going on. And so I would say he's long since been retired and out of ministry. He may even have passed away by now. I don't know what his status is, but he had a big impact on me. And I know he had a big impact on my wife, even though we didn't know, quote unquote, know him personally, but we were involved enough with the church and saw enough with the church and everything that the church was always a part of our life, that carried through. And it was only years later, looking back at it, I could see, okay, those kinds of things that as I was going through, that I did not realize at the time, because I was not planning on going into ministry or anything else.
Yeah.
That way. But then looking back on it later, I can kind of see those things there. So,
boy, I really appreciate all of your answers. And, David, you just talked about a guy who I think you said he was a pastor of a larger church.
Yes.
Okay. But none of us knew of him. Right. Okay. And so I guess what I'm encouraged by this in your answers is, church leader, be encouraged that you're going to have an influence and people aren't going to know your name. People aren't going to know who you guys didn't know who my grandfather was. I mean, and then even when we're influenced by someone, that goes away. David, again, your example, you're like, I don't even know if he's still alive anymore. That doesn't take away any impact that he had on your life. All that to say is that it won't be until eternity until we realize the impact that we have had in people's lives and whether or not God is bearing fruit in our ministry in some ways. And so every one of our examples, they're relatively obscure people or completely obscure people that God uses. And so I guess that's just an encouraging note to end on here is that, stay faithful. Amen. And God will use how he wants to use, and we may never ever see it again. So thanks, guys. Let's do this. I just want to say when we're done with this call, one of the purposes is that we pray for each other. So we won't take time on the call to do that right now, but let me just encourage you before you move on with your day. Who was on this call. Could you just take a minute and pray for each person before you move on to the next thing? So thanks so much for joining us on this this first LEAP discussion. We'll look forward to many more. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.